Great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. I met John Jordan about 30-something years ago, I think. I went to the first Dickens universe ever. Kind of accidentally fell on it, and I'm amazed every time I ask him for a favor like this, contact him in any way, he remembers who I am. Because he has dealt with hundreds, thousands of Dickens aficionados over the years. He's taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz since 1968, which I think is a record of some sort. And he's founding director with Murray Baumgarten of the Dickens Project there. Some of you may have read about the Dickens Project in the New Yorker magazine this summer, which got great attention there. Some of you may know the Dickens Project just as you start doing your research on Great Expectations or any other Dickens work as one of the great resources in this state. It's actually an international consortium of universities, of faculty and graduate students who are interested in reading and writing about Dickens and talking about it. In addition to numerous essays and reviews, he's the editor of 6 books, including the Cambridge Companion to Charles Dickens, Victorian Imagination and the Victorian Literature and the Victorian Visual Imagination, and Literature in the Marketplace. It's okay, Diane, come on in. Literature in the Marketplace, 19th Century British Publishing and Reading Practices. On some of these, he shares editing credit with some of his colleagues from the Dickens Project. It's truly a collaborative project. It's a wonderful thing to become involved in, and you don't have to be a scholar to do it. You can be just an everyday lover of Dickens. Most recently, he published a book on Bleak House, which he has been promoting, and you can find on Amazon. One of Dickens's great novels, if you haven't had a chance to read that one. So without any more ado, making sure everybody gets a seat, Professor John Jordan.
Thank you, Melissa. How's the sound? Let me try a little bit of echo, but I will proceed. Yes, 2 microphones. That's part of the problem. So my title is Dickens at 200, Why Keep Reading Him Today? And as you certainly know, I've seen the posters around the campus here. This is the bicentenary of Dickens's birth. Dickens was born on February 7th, 1812, and 2012 is thus the 200th birthday of Charles Dickens. And as you might imagine, there have been celebrations around the world, conferences, festivals, celebration events of various kinds. And the most important of these has been in England, as you might suspect. And on February 7th, there was a series of events, and I had the good fortune to be there. As a Dickens scholar, I was participating in a conference in London and got an invitation to attend the wreath laying at Westminster Abbey. And the wreath laying is something that happens every year on Dickens's birthday, but this year, because it was the 200th anniversary, there was a special wreath laying, and the royal family was there in the person of Prince Charles. So I'm going to, I think I can show you the short video clip of, where did my video go? No, maybe I'm not going to be able to show this to you. It's Safari in Firefox. Firefox, yeah. Yeah, here we are. So, yes, and I'm going to talk while this is going because you'll see the actual wreath laying. There's Prince Charles. There is the Duchess of Cornwall, Camilla, his wife. And one of the, as I was queuing this up this morning, one of the things that I discovered is that I'm actually in the picture. This is, it was quite astonishing. No photography was allowed, but there was a BBC, and there I am, right there in the back. So this was a discovery just this morning. So you see Prince Charles laying the wreath, and then a couple of members of the Dickens family coming forward and placing smaller wreaths on the grave. So that's really as much as I wanted to show you of this. And I'll go back to my PowerPoint. Yes. The other event that took place was a dinner, a seated dinner for 200 people at the Lord Mayor's house in London. And in a single room, a banquet room, 200 people, and there were speeches, there were presentations, the Dickens family was there, and one of the things that was presented was the display of a new 2-pound coin with Dickens's profile on the coin, and this is a little description of it. And all of this prompted me to think just a little bit about the fact that in this country, we do not have any men or women of letters on our currency or on our coins. They're only political figures. And in England, Dickens is really a national writer. Dickens and Shakespeare are the two writers in Britain who have a kind of iconic stature. I mean, there are other famous writers, certainly from England, Jane Austen, but Dickens and Shakespeare really transcend all the others. And it gave me a pause for just a second to think about who the American writer is, who's comparable to Dickens, who would be like Shakespeare or Dickens, the American national writer. And we have no place in this country. We have no place like Westminster Abbey, the Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey, where great writers are buried and are celebrated in this annual way. And perhaps Mark Twain would be the iconic American writer. Melville, but Melville for Moby Dick and not really for the other novels. Twain for Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer, but beyond that, I'm not sure. But Dickens stands out above all novelists in England as someone who is of great interest to scholars like myself, and also who continues to have a popular appeal. And the popular appeal of Dickens is testified to by the number of films and TV miniseries that continue to be made based on his work. And so one of the things that happened in connection with the bicentenary, because I am the director of the Dickens Project, and people looking for information about Dickens often come to the Dickens Project website, I started getting telephone calls from journalists from all around the world saying, why read Dickens today? What's so important about Dickens? And I spoke to journalists from China, from Australia, from Britain. Even the British called up an American scholar to ask why we should continue to read Dickens today. And so in the course of giving some 20-odd interviews with journalists, I developed my own little set of answers. And so I'm going to share my answers of why keep reading Dickens today, 200 years after his birth. And I'm going to give some examples taken from Great Expectations. And so I'll be reading some passages, and I'll be putting them up on the screen for you to see. And most of the examples that I'm going to use come from the first 1/3 of the novel. It's a novel that's divided into 3 sections or 3 stages, and I'm particularly fond of passages in the first third of the novel. So that's where my examples will come from. And my answers to the journalists, when the journalists say, why keep reading Dickens today? I'll tell you the 5 things that I have developed as an answer. And the first reason is that Dickens is a great storyteller. And his stories are ones that have continued to appeal to filmmakers and other novelists who've adapted his stories. But beyond the fact that his stories are of interest, he's also interested in storytelling as a practice. And storytelling, narrative, is really an important part of human experience. It's the way that we make sense of our lives. It's the way, every day when you wake up, you're telling yourself a story about what you're going to do that day and who you are as a person and how today's events fit into the larger narrative of your life. So in Dickens's novels, there are a great many storytellers. So it's both Dickens as a storyteller and then the characters inside his novels who are themselves storytellers. And Great Expectations is full of storytellers. Pip is the main storyteller because he's telling the story of his own life, but Magwitch has a story, Miss Havisham has a story, even the minor characters have stories. So anyway, the first point is that Dickens is a great narrative artist and a great storyteller. The second reason that Dickens is memorable and that we keep reading him today is because of the characters in his novels. And his characters are often larger than life. They are often grotesque. His characters are memorable. People who've never read a Dickens novel know what it means to call someone a Scrooge. And many of his books have acquired the status of almost the status of a myth, a modern myth. They've become more than just novels in paperback editions. They've become things that circulate through the culture generally. And it's his characters, I think, that contribute a lot to that memorable quality of his books. And then along with that, one of the things that makes the characters memorable is his comedy. Dickens is a great comic writer. He's funny, and the way to appreciate Dickens's comedy, I think, is to read him aloud. And when students have difficulty reading Dickens, one of the things that I encourage them to do is to read him aloud. That's how I got started reading Dickens. My grandmother was a great lover of Dickens, and she read him aloud to me when I was a boy. She said that she had never met anyone in her life whom she had not first encountered in the pages of Dickens's novels. So I inherit that interest in Dickens. So the comedy of his novels is another great aspect of his work. And then a fourth reason to keep reading Dickens today is that he writes about issues of social justice that are still with us today. Issues of child abuse, issues of class conflict, issues of greed and materialism, bureaucracy. He has a novel called Little Dorrit in which there's an institution called the Circumlocution Office. I know you have all been members of the Circumlocution Office, the bureaucracy that just sends you from one place to another and you never get an answer to any question that you ask. Bleak House, the novel that I just finished writing a book about, has a great satire on judicial delay. The fact that lawsuits sometimes last for generations. So Dickens is really attuned to issues that are not just 19th century issues, but that also continue to preoccupy us today. So that's four reasons. His narratives, his ability as a storyteller, his characters, his comedy, the themes, the social themes that he addresses. But really, the most important reason to keep reading Dickens today is his language. And I think that that's why you want to read any writer, is to engage with the words on the page. Dickens is one of the great writers in English prose. And that's what I want to try and demonstrate. I want to try and demonstrate this by giving you examples from Great Expectations, mostly from the beginning of the novel. And language is important in all of these. It's the way in which characters come to us. It's the way in which the comedy comes to us. It's the way in which the social themes and the stories address us. So Dickens's language, there are two aspects to Dickens's language that I like to emphasize. One is his ability to capture the voices of people through a whole scale of society. His ability to imitate the voice of different people. And he's, in that sense, a mimic. And the best way to appreciate that is to try and perform Dickens yourself, to read him aloud. Read, not the whole novel, because he wrote long novels, but read just snatches of Dickens, read passages of dialogue. So I'm going to try and do that a little bit today. And then the other is in the narration. And the narration, the narrative voice that Dickens uses, in Great Expectations, it's the narrative voice of Pip, is something that rewards close attention because there are multiple levels of significance. in Great Expectations, particularly in the first third of the novel, you have Dickens working with the point of view of a child. So he's representing the experience of the world as seen by a small child, by a young boy. But the novel is being narrated by an older Pip. And so one of the things that you need to pay attention to is that this older Pip, an adult, a mature Pip, is looking back on his life and his experience and telling it. And you need to ask yourselves as you read that narration, why he's telling it. What is his motive for telling the story? So you're simultaneously reading the child Pip and you're reading the adult Pip who's recreating his childhood experience and who's doing that for some reason. So you need to ask, why is he telling us this story? What's he trying to prove either to himself or to the readers of his narrative? And then the third layer is Dickens himself. And Dickens is controlling the language that Pip, the narrator, is using in order to represent the childhood experience. So there's the child, there's the adult Pip, and then finally behind that is Dickens. So some passages from Great Expectations, and mostly at the beginning here from the first chapter. And you remember this wonderful opening chapter when the convict emerges from the mud. I don't know if people have seen the recent film adaptation of Great Expectations that has aired the past couple of weeks in this country on PBS. But one of the things that they do really well in that film adaptation or TV adaptation is to show the convict sort of emerging out of the mud. He's covered with mud. And it's as if he is emerging out of the ground itself, or really out of a grave. It's as if Pip's dead father has come back to life and is emerging as a kind of terrible ogre. And so this is the description that we get: a fearful man, all in coarse gray, with a great iron on his leg, a man with no hat and with broken shoes and with an old rag tied round his head, a man who had been soaked in water and smothered in mud and lame by stones and cut by flint and stung by nettles and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as they seized me by the chin. So it's this, this boogeyman that has suddenly surged up out of the earth, out of the grave, and who has grabbed Pip and turned him upside down. And just the rhythm of the prose here, I think, catches some of the magical quality. There's something slightly surreal about this experience. It's as if a ghost has appeared, a horrible, horrible figure. So the man threatens Pip. He's an escaped convict, of course, and what he tells Pip is that he wants him to bring him a file, and he wants him to bring him whittles, something to eat. And so this is the passage in which the convict speaks to the young Pip. And it's, again, Dickens writing in the voice of the convict, or Pip. You need to remember this is Pip, the older Pip, remembering and recreating this voice of the convict, and also behind that, Dickens manipulating this language. So the convict speaks to Pip and says, "You bring me tomorrow morning early that file and them whittles. You bring the lot to me at that old battery over yonder. You do it, and you never dare to say a word or dare to make a sign concerning your having seen such a person as me, or any person somever, and you shall be let to live. You fail, or you go from my words in any particular, no matter how small it is, and your heart and your liver shall be tore out and roasted and ate. Now, I ain't alone, as you may think I am. There's a young man hid with me, in comparison with which young man I am an angel. That young man hears the words I speak. That young man has a secret way peculiar to himself of getting at a boy and at his heart and at his liver. It is in vain for a boy to attempt to hide himself from that young man. A boy may lock his door, may be warm in bed, may tuck himself up, may draw the clothes over his head, may think himself comfortable and safe, but that young man will softly creep his way to him and tear him open. I am a-keeping that young man from harming of you at the present moment with great difficulty. I find it very hard to hold that young man off your inside. Now, what do you say? So, it's terrifying, this horrible figure has surged up out of the mud, a ghost, a grotesque figure, and then there's somebody else who's even worse than that, who's going to creep into Pip's bed. So I'm interested in this threat that the convict makes of the young man, the horrible young man, and that memory sticks in Pip's mind, and it continues into the rest of this chapter. So Pip goes home, and he, out of fear about this horrible man, and then the horrible young man, who is even worse because he's invisible and can come into Pip's room, he makes the decision to steal some food, to steal a file and to steal some food. And so this is the description of Pip leaving to go back to his home. And he says, the marshes were just a long black horizontal line then as I stopped to look after him. And the river was just another horizontal line, not nearly so broad nor yet so black. And the sky was just a row of long, angry red lines made dense black lines and dense black lines intermixed. On the edge of the river, I could faintly make out the only two black things in all the prospect that seemed to be standing out, the only two black things upright. One of these was the beacon by which the sailors steered like an unhooped cask upon a pole, an ugly thing when you were near it. The other, a gibbet with some chains hanging to it, which had once held a pirate. The man was limping on toward this ladder as if he were the pirate come to life and come down and going back to hook himself up again. It gave me a terrible turn when I thought so. And as I saw the cattle lifting their heads to gaze after him, I wondered whether they thought so too. I looked all round for the horrible young man and could see no signs of him. But now I was frightened again and ran home without stopping. So one thing that Dickens has done very subtly here in this passage, it's a passage that begins with almost a kind of abstract description of the landscape. Long black horizontal lines, the river another horizontal line, the sky a row of long angry red lines and dense black lines. It's almost like a Mondrian or an abstract painting, just lines. But at the end of this passage, Pip looks around for the horrible young man, and he says that he could see no signs of him. And I think one of the things that Dickens has done here is to give us a clue to something that is going to develop later on in the novel, which is that Pip is the horrible young man. And the reason that Pip can't see the horrible young man is that he's the horrible young man. The way that he will turn his back on Joe, the father figure who has taken care of him, the way that he will turn his back on his past, the way when he gets the news that he has great expectations and will become a gentleman, Pip turns into a kind of, not a disfigured, horrible, grotesque person, but into someone who is a kind of moral, horrible young man, a moral monster. This is an anticipation of things that will come. So here's the description of Pip stealing the food to take to the convict. And this is a passage I love to teach to students in my classes. So as soon as the great black velvet pall outside my little window was shot with gray, I got up and went downstairs. Every board upon the way and every crack in every board calling after me, "Stop, thief!" and "Get up, Mrs. Joe!" In the pantry, which was far more abundantly supplied than usual owing to the season, it's Christmas time, I was very much alarmed by a hare hanging up by the heels whom I rather thought I caught when my back was half turned, winking. I had no time for verification, no time for selection, no time for anything, for I had no time to spare. I stole some bread, some rind of cheese, about half a jar of mincemeat, which I tied up in my pocket handkerchief with my last night's slice, some brandy from a stone bottle, which I decanted into a glass bottle I had secretly used for making that intoxicating fluid Spanish licorice water up in my room, diluting the stone bottle from a jug in the kitchen cupboard, a meat bone with very little on it, and a beautiful, round, compact pork pie. I was nearly going away without the pie, but I was tempted to mount upon a shelf to look what it was that was put away so carefully in a covered earthenware dish in a corner, and I found it was the pie, and I took it in the hope that it was not intended for early use and would not be missed for some time. Now, what's interesting for me about this passage is that Pip is frightened. He's still frightened of the horrible convict. He's still frightened about the horrible young man. And so he has no time. He's scared to death that he'll be caught. He goes and he grabs the first things that come to hand. And then he thinks about the pie. And notice how the language, the prose of the sentence slows down when he begins to focus on the pie, because Pip wants that pie. Pip wants that pie for himself. So, and a beautiful, round, compact pork pie. He appreciates, he almost tastes that pork pie. I was nearly going away without the pie, but I was tempted to mount upon a shelf to look what it was that was put away so carefully in a covered earthenware dish in a corner, and I found it was the pie, and I took it in the hope that it was not intended for early use. So Pip is stealing that pie, not just to give to the convict, not just because he's frightened about the horrible young man, but because he, as a child in that family, never gets to eat anything but the worst leftovers, the food that the family gives to him. And here he sees a chance to steal something that he really wants. So later on, Pip will feel guilty for having stolen the food. And he's correct to feel guilty because he has stolen something for himself and not just for the convict. So that's a wonderful passage. Later on, I'm going to go on to another sequence that I like very much in the book, which is the scene, and it follows from what I've just read to you. It's the scene with Uncle Pumblechook. And Uncle Pumblechook is a relative of the family. He's Joe's uncle. But Mrs. Joe, Pip's sister, has appropriated him, and so here is Pip's description of Uncle Pumblechook. And Uncle Pumblechook is one of those minor comic characters in Dickens who is unforgettable. And Pip doesn't like Uncle Pumblechook because Uncle Pumblechook is always telling him that he has no right to be eating at the dinner table. And in fact, there are even suggestions that if Pip were a squeaker or a pig, that they would be eating Pip. So this is the introduction of Uncle Pumblechook. And the font is a little different here. I typed this in myself. I opened the door to the company, and they're coming for Christmas dinner, making believe that it was a habit of ours to open that door. And I opened it first to Mr. Wopsle, next to Mr. and Mrs. Hubble, and last of all to Uncle Pumblechook. N.B. I was not allowed to call him uncle under the severest penalties. Now, what is N.B.? N.B. is a Latin tag. It stands for nota bene. It means notice well. Take note of this. Now, N.B. Who is writing N.B.? This is not Pip the little boy. Pip the little boy doesn't know N.B. In fact, Pip the little boy at this point doesn't even know how to write. So you have to understand that N.B., this little Latin tag, is coming from the older Pip, the older narrator who's telling this story in retrospect. And he's telling us something important about the family dynamics in this family, which is that he, Pip, the little boy, is forbidden to call Uncle Pumblechook uncle. But notice that he calls him Uncle Pumblechook in the text that we are reading. So every time that Pip addresses him in the narrative as Uncle Pumblechook, he's violating the prohibition that was imposed on him as a child. So here's the description. Mrs. Joe, said Uncle Pumblechook, a large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man with a mouth like a fish, dull, staring eyes, and sandy hair standing upright on his head so that he looked as if he had just been all but choked and had that very moment come to. I have brought you, as the compliments of the season, I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of sherry wine, and I have brought you, Mum, a bottle of port wine. Well, Uncle Pumblechook is very pretentious and full of himself, and Pip hates him. And so he gives us this description of Uncle Pumblechook, a large, hard-breathing, middle-aged, slow man with a mouth like a fish. I mean, this is one of these grotesque comic characters in Dickens. Dull, staring eyes and sandy hair standing upright on his head, so that he looked as if he had been all but choked. and had that very moment come too. So the question that I ask is, who is choking Uncle Pumblechook? And it's Pip. It's Pip, the older narrator, who's getting his revenge on Uncle Pumblechook, who's reaching back through the language of narration, of storytelling, to give us a description of this man, and violating the prohibition that he had as a child, that he was not to address him as uncle, and taking every opportunity to call him uncle, because he takes pleasure in doing that, and then to use language, to use the power of language in order to strangle Uncle Pumblechook, and then release him just at the moment when he's about to expire. So this is part of the comedy of a Dickens novel, but it's also part of the way in which Dickens is manipulating language and allowing Pip to manipulate language in order to accomplish something, which is to take revenge on someone who made him miserable when he was a child. So the scene with Uncle Pumblechook continues. And there's a dinner scene that I'm skipping, but there's a famous scene that involves tar water. So I'm going to read the tar water scene. And this is a little bit longer passage. So Uncle Pumblechook begins, and his Mrs. Joe offers, after they have eaten the meal, offers him a glass of brandy. "Have a little brandy, Uncle," said my sister. And then Pip takes over, and Pip is frightened, because he remembers that he stole brandy from the pantry in order to give to the convict, and he filled up the bottle from a stone bottle that was nearby. And we find out what was in that stone bottle. Oh heavens, this is Pip, it had come at last. He would find it was weak. He would say it was weak, and I was lost. I held tight to the leg of the table under the cloth with both hands and awaited my fate. He's clutching onto the leg of the table. He's so frightened as a boy. My sister went out for the stone bottle, came back with the stone bottle, and poured his brandy out, no one else taking any. The wretched man trifled with his glass, took it up, looked at it through the light, put it down, prolonged my misery. All this time, Mrs. Joe and Joe were briskly clearing the table for the pie and pudding. I couldn't keep my eyes off him. Always holding tight by the leg of the table with my hands and feet, I saw the miserable creature finger his glass playfully, take it up, smile, throw his head back, and drink the brandy off. Instantly afterwards, the company were seized with unspeakable consternation, owing to his springing to his feet, turning round several times in an appalling, spasmodic, whooping cough dance, and rushing out at the door. He then became visible through the window, violently plunging and expectorating, making the most hideous faces, and apparently out of his mind. I held on tight while Mrs. Joe and Joe ran to him. I didn't know how I had done it, but I had no doubt I had murdered him somehow. In my dreadful situation, it was a relief when he was brought back, and surveying the company all round as if they had disagreed with him, sank down into his chair with the one significant gasp, "Tar." I had filled up the bottle from the tar water jug. I knew he would be worse by and by. I moved the table like a medium of the present day by the vigor of my unseen hold upon it. "Tar!" cried my sister in amazement. "Why, however could tar come there?" So that's where I'm going to stop. But what interests me about this is that this continues what I described in the previous passage, where the older Pip takes revenge on Uncle Pumblechook by telling this story about him. And the key line, or one of the key lines in this passage, is that I knew he would be worse by and by. Because what is tar water? Tar water in the 19th century was a diuretic. It was what parents gave to children when they were constipated in order to make their bowels move. So Pip has inadvertently filled up the brandy bottle, knowing somehow unconsciously that it was going to be ready, it was going to be used for Uncle Pumblechook. So Uncle Pumblechook has both the bad taste in his mouth, but it's also going to affect his bowels. So this is something, a way in which adults torture young children in the 19th century, and perhaps even in the 20th and 21st, to try and make their bowels behave. And Pip has managed to get revenge on Uncle Pumblechook, to use Uncle Pumblechook as a character in the story that Pip is telling, and get back at him for the way that Pip has been treated. But there's another line in this passage that really interests me, and it's this motif about Pip holding on to the table leg. And he's holding on to the table leg both because he's frightened to death. He's scared that he's going to be found out, that people will learn that he's the one who filled up the brandy bottle with the tar water. But he said, I had filled up the bottle from the tar water jug. I knew he would be worse by and by. I moved the table like a medium of the present day by the vigor of my unseen hold upon it. Now, what is a medium of the present day? This is a reference to something that was a 19th century cultural practice and that still exists today, which is table turning, mediums, people who communicate with the spirits in the other world. So Pip is saying that he's holding on to the leg of the table, and he's so frightened that he lifts the table. He lifts the table. I moved the table like a medium of the present day. But what else is a medium of the present day? That's Pip, the older narrator, who is the medium, if you will, using the medium of language in order to tell this story. So a medium of the present day is the present day Pip who's telling this story and getting delight from telling the story about how he made Uncle Pumblechook experience the same kind of humiliation that Pip, experienced as a boy. So you have all three levels working here. You have the child Pip who's frightened to death. You have the adult Pip who's telling this story. And then you have Dickens who's using this reference to the medium of the present day. And the medium is the medium of language, as well as this reference to spiritualism and table turning. So that's a favorite passage of mine. It's Dickens' comedy as well. So here's another passage I like a lot. And this you will recognize. This is the first letter that Pip writes to his friend Joe. And it's written, it's interesting in a number of ways. For one thing, it gives us a clue as to the level of literacy that the young Pip has. Everything that we read, all this wonderful narration, can't come from young Pip because young Pip is just learning how to read and write. So this is his first attempt at writing, and you need to compare this level of literacy with the level of literacy in the narrative that we're reading from the beginning of the book, that magnificent description of the convict. So I often ask my students to read this, and you have to read it aloud because it's phonetically transcribed. So I'll read it, and it also tells you something about Pip's accent, because Pip has a working class accent. And if Pip becomes a gentleman later on, it's only because he manages somehow to hide or to conceal his working class background and his working class accent. And he probably isn't completely successful in that attempt. So here's his first attempt at writing. My dear Joe, I hope you are quite well. I hope I shall soon be able for to teach you, Joe, and then we shall be so glad. And when I am prentiged to you, Joe, what larks? And believe me, and the last part of this is more difficult for people to make out. So I ask my students how they read the last two or the last three words there. And this is another place where Dickens's manipulation of the language is very subtle and very complex. So it's I-N-F, X-N, and then Pip. This is Pip signing off. And so it's phonetic. What Pip is trying to say is in affection, Pip. But when you look at it, I think many of you may be a little puzzled by what it doesn't make sense until you sort of construe the complete phonetic, that the word F is the letter F is the first syllable of affection. But when you look at it again, you see that there's a pun, a play on words that Dickens is introducing here, that the letters INFXN could be pronounced infection. And what is happening here is that Pip is writing a letter to Joe. Joe is his best friend. Joe lives in the same house with Pip. There's no need for Pip to write a letter to Joe. He can talk to Joe. He doesn't need to write letters at all. So this is a writing exercise, and it's one of the first steps that Pip takes in order to aspire to become better than his origins, to rise socially. And literacy education is always a way that people rise in station. But it also introduces a wedge between him and Joe, because Joe is someone who doesn't know how to read and write. And his relationship with Pip is a relationship, his friendship, their intimacy, their love is based on oral communication. Joe is someone who lives in an oral culture. And Pip is now moving out of the oral culture into a literate culture. And that move is a move that takes him away from Joe. So in affection, the statement that is a bond of his love for Joe is also infection. It's also the beginning of a kind of disease, a disease of social climbing, a disease of aspiration to be better, to leave behind one's origins. And that's a play that Dickens has introduced, the idea that there's something infected about the relationship between Pip and Joe. And that's one of the ways in which Pip will become a horrible young man. He will become a horrible young man because he mistreats Joe, turns his back on his origins. There's maybe even another play on words in this passage, which is, it could be in fiction. There's another play on words that hides in this, and that could be a reference back to the novel itself, that Pip is moving into a world of literacy, but that world of literacy also has wonderful dimensions to it. It's the world of Dickens's own art, the world of fiction. So these are examples. I'm gonna skip over the next example because I want to leave some time for questions. But the passage that I quoted here is Pip's account of his first visit to Miss Havisham. And that's a story that Pip tells, and it's completely made up. It's a falsehood, if you will. But it's also a fiction. It's a wonderful fiction that Pip invents. So the relationship between falsehood, telling lies, and creating imaginative worlds is something that this passage introduces. And I'll read one more passage, and then I'll stop. And this is the description of the fight that takes place between Joe and Orlick. It's a little bit later in the first third of the novel. And remember that Joe is a blacksmith, and he has an apprentice whose name is Orlick, who is an older boy who doesn't like Pip because Pip is getting favored treatment at the forge where Joe works. And there's a strange relationship between Orlick and Mrs. Joe, the shrewish sister-mother figure that Pip has. And this is a passage that describes the fight that takes place between between Orlick and Joe. So, my sister had been standing silent in the yard within hearing. She was a most unscrupulous spy and listener, and she instantly looked in at one of the windows. "Like you fool," she said to Joe, "giving holidays to great idle hulkers like that. You are a rich man, upon my life, to waste wages in that way. I wish I was his master." "You'd be everybody's master if you durst," retorted Orlick with an ill-favored grin. "Let her alone," said Joe. Notice that Joe's statement is in parentheses here. I'd be a match for all the noodles and all rogues, returned my sister, beginning to work herself into a mighty rage. And I couldn't be a match for the noodles without being a match for your master, who's the dunder-headed king of the noodles. And I couldn't be a match for the rogues without being a match for you, who are the blackest looking and the worst rogue between this and France now. You're a foul shrew, Mother Gargery, growled the journeyman. If that makes a judge of rogues, you ought to be a good one. Let her alone, will you, said Joe. Joe's intervention again in parentheses. What did you say, cried my sister, beginning to scream. What did you say? What did that fellow Orlick say to me, Pip? What did he call me, with my husband standing by? Oh, oh, oh. Each of these exclamations was a shriek, and I must remark of my sister what is equally true of all the violent women I have ever seen, that passion was no excuse for her, because it is undeniable that instead of lapsing into passion, she consciously and deliberately took extraordinary pains to force herself into it, and became blindly furious by regular stages. What was the name he gave me before that base man who swore to defend me? Oh, hold me, oh. Ah, growled the journeyman between his teeth. I'd hold you if you was my wife. I'd hold you under the pump and choke it out of you. I tell you, let her alone, said Joey. Oh, to hear him, cried my sister with a clap of her hands and a scream together, which was her next stage. To hear the names he's giving me, that Orlick in my own house, me, a married woman, with my husband standing by. Oh, oh. Here my sister, after a fit of clappings and screamings, beat her hands upon her bosom and upon her knees and threw her cap off and pulled her hair down, which were the last stages on her road to frenzy. Being by this time a perfect fury and a complete success, she made a dash at the door, which I had fortunately locked. What could the wretched Joe do now, after his disregarded parenthetical interruptions, but stand up to his journeyman and ask him what he meant by interfering betwixt himself and Mrs. Joe, and further, whether he was man enough to come on? Old Orlick felt that the situation admitted of nothing less than coming on, and was on his defense straightway. So, without so much as pulling off their singed and burnt aprons, they went at one another like two giants. But if any man in that neighborhood could stand up long against Joe, I never saw the man. Orlick, as if he had been of no more account than the pale young gentleman, was very soon among the coal dust and in no hurry to come out of it. Then Joe unlocked the door and picked up my sister, who had dropped insensible at the window, but who had seen the fight first, I think, and who was carried into the house and laid down, and who was recommended to revive and would do nothing but struggle and clench her hands in Joe's hair. Then came that singular calm and silence which succeed all uproars. And then, with the vague sensation which I have always connected with such a lull, namely that it was Sunday and somebody was dead, I went upstairs to dress myself. Now, this is, again, combat's funny scene, Joe's parenthetical interventions until finally he's provoked into a fight. But what interests me most about this passage is that I read it as a flirtation between Orlick and Mrs. Joe, that what they're really doing is flirting with each other and pretending, Mrs. Joe is pretending to be angry. And what finally happens is that she provokes Joe into the fight with Orlick, and Joe predictably defeats Orlick, and then he picks her up and carries her upstairs, and they have sex. You know, people say there's no sex in Victorian novels, but what has happened is that Joe has been provoked by Mrs. Joe, by his wife, into displaying his manliness, and then he picks her up, and she has watched the whole fight to the end. Then she faints, he carries her upstairs, and Pip, this is from the child's perspective, doesn't understand what happens upstairs, except he notices that singular calm and silence which succeed all uproars, and then with the vague sensation which I've always connected with such a lull, namely that it was Sunday and somebody was dead, I went upstairs to dress myself. So you have to learn how to read Dickens carefully in order to get the stories that are submerged, and this is just one of many examples about the rewards of reading him and his language closely. So I'm going to stop at this point, and there are about 10 minutes left in the time that we have available. I'd be happy to take questions about the passages that I've read, or about Great Expectations, or really about anything in Dickens. So I'll stop at this point. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
Curious about the family that's still alive. How large and how many?
The Dickens family, you mean? There are, I'm not going to remember the exact number, but at the dinner at the Lord Mayor's house, there were over 100 members of the Dickens family present. Yeah, the remote and the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of Dickens are there. And there are still members of the Dickens family who go around and read or perform the scenes from Dickens's novels that Dickens himself adapted for public reading, Gerald Dickens in particular.
They are family members receive all the royalties.
Are the family members what? No, the novels are out of copyright. They're in the public domain, and so there's no direct income that comes. If a member of the family does a public performance, then that's compensated, of course. But yeah. Other questions? Yes.
We're told that Dickens' favorite work is verses of David Copperfield. Did you know anything about his opinion or his feeling of Great Expectations?
The question was that Dickens said that his favorite novel among all the novels that he wrote was David Copperfield. What do we know about Dickens's feelings about Great Expectations? One of the things that we know is that he went back and reread David Copperfield before he sat down to write Great Expectations, because both David Copperfield and Great Expectations are first-person autobiographical stories about boys growing up in the world. And so he didn't want to repeat what he had done in David Copperfield. Dickens also, another thing that we know about Great Expectations is that Dickens did a public reading from Great Expectations. He prepared a public reading from Great Expectations. And he did that only with the books that he had the greatest affection for. Great Expectations was published in a magazine that Dickens edited in weekly installments. And so his usual mode was monthly serialization, but this one came out in weekly installments. Other questions? Yes. Yes.
Could you speak a bit about Dickens' own education, background, what schools he went to, and also, as a follow-on, if you could talk about his great love for hiking and leaving London.
Yes.
Into the
Dickens had about 4 years of formal education. He went to a grammar school when he was living in the country, and then his father moved the family. His father was always in debt, moved the family to London, and when they moved to London, Dickens was put to work famously in a shoe polish factory, a blacking factory. So he came to London with the expectation that his education would continue, but instead he was put into a factory, engaged in child labor. And his father was subsequently imprisoned for debt. And in the 19th century, debtors were put in prison until they could pay off their debt. And another strange practice in the 19th century was that when a man, a husband, father, went into debtor's prison, the whole family moved in with him. But because young Charles had a job in the blacking factory, he was not allowed to live with the family. So it was as if he had been abandoned by the family. So he stayed working for around a year, not that long, but for a child it must have seemed like forever. Then, because of an inheritance, his father was able to pay off the debt, and then after that, Dickens was sent to a school in London for another a little over 2 years. That's all the formal education that he had. So otherwise, we know that he had a ticket to read at the British Library, and he's self-educated. So that's the answer to the question of formal education. One of the pastimes that Dickens engaged in was walking. And it's how he did several things by walking. He walked as much as 20 miles a night. And it was a way in which he let off steam after a day spent writing. But it was also a way in which he gathered information for his novels. He befriended the police, the detective police, that was a new institution in the 19th century, and traveled with the police to the most, the darkest parts of London, the slums, and gathered material for his novels in that way. But he also walked out into the country 10 miles and 10 miles back. And that was it was a way in which he composed. For him, it was both a release, and it was also a way in which he thought about what he was working on and prepared to write the next day. So he's called, some people call him a heroic pedestrian.
There are stories that he disappeared for days and days, left the family and went into the North Country and so forth. Is that?
He did not disappear. That is, he did go on excursions, particularly sort of during the 1850s when he became friends with a group of younger men, and he traveled to the continent with them. He took tours around England, but he didn't disappear in the sense of not letting anyone know where he was going or anything like that. But he did like to travel and did like to tour, and walking tours in particular. So, yes?
True that he had two endings for the Great Expectations?
Yes, there often, and it's a problem of interpretation that every teacher of Great Expectations must deal with. He wrote an ending to the novel, and then showed it to his friend Edward Bulwer-Lytton, a fellow novelist. And Bulwer-Lytton said, this is too sad an ending. And he said, I think you need to write it again. So he rewrote the ending, and there's considerable debate about whether the second ending, the one that is published in all editions of the novel, is a happy ending or not. I think it still is a very ambiguous ending. The first ending that he wrote is, I think everyone would agree, an unhappy ending to the story. The second ending is much more ambiguous. But I'll follow this up by saying that there is a scholar, the scholar who is the editor of the Norton Critical Edition, which is the most up-to-date textual analysis of Dickens, has written an article that's published in that volume called The Six Endings of Great Expectations. Because if you study the textual history, Dickens revised ever so slightly the language, for example, of the final sentence of the novel. So this scholar, who's very familiar with all the different editions that appeared during Dickens's lifetime, argues that there are 6 different endings to Great Expectations. So but there are 2 principal endings. One unhappy, and the other up to this. Yeah. Yes.
One more question. Is anything known about his writing process, because he has so many of these characters, sub-characters, if you will. I'm just picturing webs of, how to keep track of it, and serialization playing a role in that, etc.
A couple of things I'll say about that. One is that we do have a story that is told by one of his daughters, Mamie Dickens. And one day she was sick, and so she stayed home from school, and she was allowed to stay in her father's study while he was writing. And her account of this is that he wrote standing up. He had a writing desk sort of like this. And so he would be standing at the desk and he would write, and then he would run over to a mirror that was on the wall. And he would screw his face up, and he was going to mumble to himself, and he would run back and start to write again. So we know that about his writing process, that he acted out the characters in front of the mirror. He became those characters and spoke the words that they speak, and then went back and wrote them down. So that's one thing that we know. Early Dickens, the early novels that Dickens wrote, he wrote with such speed that there's almost no plan or no sense of where they're going. And the plots are often very chaotic or just episodic, one thing after another. But beginning with Martin Chuzzlewit, and then particularly with Dombey and Son, sort of the middle of his career, he began to make plans. And so these plans, these working notes, are preserved. And all of the novels were published serially. And so he would block out the the shape of a particular installment. And he would write for the first 2 weeks of the month, finish his installment, and then spend the last 2 weeks of the month doing all the many other things that he as a Victorian public man did. So he became very disciplined and very controlled, and the novels are much more tightly structured. They're not just episodic, linear. And those working notes, those plans are preserved, and they're often available in the appendix to the paperback editions of the novels. So, okay. So,
Thank you very much, John.
thank you.
That was great.
Good.
Thank you. That's very good.
Good, glad you enjoyed it.